Hi. Hi, Maya. Hi, Yvette. Um, just wanted to do a quick sound check, so I'm gonna unmute you, Maya, first.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Great.
Thanks. I'm just gonna put you back on mute and test Yvette.
Okay.
Hi, Yvette.
Hi, Alex. I'm also here.
Yep. Can you speak a bit louder or closer
Yeah,
to?
sure.
Yes, that's perfect. Okay,
Okay.
great. So I'll put you again on mute, and once Boema will be online, I will sound test her too.
Okay.
Hi, Boema.
Hi, how are you?
Great. Good. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. I'm just wanted to do a quick sound check. Both Maya and Yvette are with us, and the sound is working. So good to see that you are working as well. So what I'll do is I'll put you on mute, and I'll mute myself as well, and then we'll officially start the webinar at 1:30 as agreed. And hopefully by then Faith will have joined as well. So speak to you.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to let you know that we will be starting with a couple of minutes delay because we are waiting for the last speakers to join. So please bear with us and apologies for the inconvenience. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the SADC Model Law webinar. My name is Alessandra Tranquilli, and I am based in the London Secretariat at Girls Not Brides, and we'll be managing the technical side of the webinar. So as our speakers and moderator are based in different parts of the world, please bear with me if we run into some connectivity issues, but hopefully things should be okay. So without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Yvette Katurima-Muya, who's Girls Not Brides Head of Africa Engagement, who will be moderating the webinar. So I'm going to mute myself, and Yvette, over to you.
Thank you, Alec, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening. Wherever you may be, we send you greetings from Girls Not Bride Secretariat. Today is a very special day. It marks 70 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, and we are still emphasizing that everyone has the right to enter into marriage only with their free and full consent. No one, therefore, should be forced into marriage, particularly as a child. In propagating the message of that we need to end child marriage, we thought that it would be a good opportunity for us to have this webinar, particularly after the launch of the SADC Model Law Guide that took place at the Africa Girls Summit. This happened in a side event on the evening of the 22nd of November, and we were privileged to have speakers from Parliament, including honorable members from Malawi and Namibia, the AU Goodwill Ambassador for the AU campaign on ending child marriage in Africa, and a special guest of honor, a former child bride, who situated us all and reminded us why we do the work we are doing. To this webinar, we are going to have a series of speakers who are going to introduce the model law to us, and then also take us through what the guide of the model law entails. And this is going to be done through PowerPoint presentations. I'd like to ask each of you, if you have a question for the speakers, to just use the chat box that you can access through clicking on the right-hand arrow that is present in orange. If you click it, you'll see a chat box that will present you questions, and you can address your question to whoever you would like to respond to your question. Having said that, I'll quickly take us through an introduction of our first speaker. We are privileged to have a representative from the Southern Africa Development Community Parliamentary Forum, that's SADC-PF, Ms. Segoma Boemo, who will present the model law to us, introduce what is in the model law, give us a quick background and the content of the model law. Ms. Boemo, you have 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Boema Sokoma is my name, and I work for the Southern Africa Development Community Parliamentary Forum, which was the body that basically developed the SADC Model Law on eradicating child marriage and protecting children already in marriage. Next slide, please. Just as a background, I think it's important to state the obvious, that the model law is a set of standards aimed at providing guidance on the issue of eradicating child marriage and its implication thereof. And this is in view of the fact that child marriage is something that is very common, especially in Southern Africa. And we recognize that it is not anything to condone or to allow to carry on, because it can lead to sexual reproductive health rights abuses. It also can result in some level of intimidation and domestic violence between the married partners. And it also confers a poor status to women's rights. We also recognize that child marriage may also constitute an abuse of different human rights of the child, such as the right to education, the right to physical and mental health, and it may also impact on liberty and freedom of movement of the child. Moreover, that child marriage also raises the concern of lack of free and informed consent for the child, particularly as it binds the partners legally beyond the age of adulthood. Next slide. Against this backdrop, it was quite clear to SADC legislatures that there's need for reinforcement of the legal and policy framework. This took place at the highest level of the state, notably through the institution of Parliament, which holds exclusive lawmaking and oversight powers on executive action. The development of the SADC Model Law on eradicating child marriage was that a logical initiative for the SADC PF, which is mandated to lead the region through interparliamentary cooperation between the 14 SADC member parliaments. The forum, with the support of organizations like Girls Not Brides Network, the UNFPA, AWEPA, and most SADC parliaments, came forward with this model law through an extensive consultation process with members of parliament, civil society organizations, academia, law associations, and other collaborating partners of the region. Next slide, please. The salient features of the SADC Model Law on eradicating child marriages enshrine standards from different international human rights instruments and gives SADC member states a legal document on which they can build on and adapt for incorporation in their domestic legislation. While the focus of the SADC Model Law is on the eradication of child marriage and the registration of all marriages on an official registry, it also contains provisions for the elimination of harmful social and cultural practices affecting the welfare, dignity, and development of the child, especially those practices which are prejudicial to the health or life of the child and practices which are discriminatory. In this sense, it also reiterates and reinforces provisions existing in other international legal instruments. Next slide, please. Part 1 and 2 are the preliminary provisions and restatements. Part 1 of the model law embodies definitions or interpretations of sections. Part 2 is the restatement of the rights and concepts relating to the child, such as concepts of the best interest of the child, protection from discrimination, equality before the law for the child, right to life, right to privacy, dignity, and respect, protection from exploitation, abuse, and protection from harmful practices, the right to education, the right to health, and protection from child labor, amongst others. Next slide, please. Part 3, prohibition of betrothals and child marriage. Part 3 contains the fundamental provisions of the model law, which are the prohibition of a child marriage, the betrothal of a child, and third-party involvement to a child marriage, such as solemnizing, aiding, or abetting, often done by parents. A contravention of these provisions would constitute an offense, and if the offender is a person on whom the child depended, such as a parental relationship, it will be considered as an aggravating circumstance. Part 3 also provides that for marriages contracted before the coming into operation of the law, they are voidable at the option of either party. There's also a provision on equal distribution of property acquired during marriage between partners of a child marriage after the latter is declared void. This equal distribution would apply unless the property has been inherited. Next slide, please. Measures. Part 4 is measures and interventions to prevent child marriage. Part 4 covers measures and interventions to prevent child marriage. An obligation is placed on the competent minister to put in place such measures and interventions in consultation with the appropriate authorities. Expenditure to carry out such measures should come from an anti-child marriage fund or such funds appropriated by government directly for such a purpose. Provision is also made for a restraining order to be made by the court to prevent a child marriage. The order is made on application of a child marriage prohibition officer, appropriate authority, or person having personal knowledge of the circumstances. There's also an obligation on the government to establish programs and incentives to assist delay marriage, including through comprehensive sexuality education. Next slide. Part 5 are measures and interventions to mitigate the effects of child marriage. Part 5 provides for measures and interventions to mitigate the effects of child marriage and protect children already in marriage. This part applies to marriages contracted before the coming into operation of the law, such as such marriages are voidable and not void. These measures include the setting up of public safety homes and other public facilities for the residence, care, and maintenance of victims of child marriage, strengthening community networks, including traditional leaders and religious authorities, and the training of officials to prevent and enforce child marriage laws. Next slide. Part 6 and 7 are access to data and enforcement. It provides for data collection, monitoring, evaluation, and public awareness to be conducted by the ministry. There is also an obligation on the government for providing child marriage education as a healthcare service by all healthcare providers, both public and private. Part 7 provides for general provisions, offences, and enforcement. It provides inter alia for state reports to be sent to the SADC PF on measures taken by the state towards eradicating child marriage and the protection of children already in marriage. Under this part, provision is made for a compliance notice, which may be issued by the minister to a party in case there has been non-compliance with the law, and a request may be accordingly made for remedial action. Provision is also made for child marriage prohibition officers and the setting up of the Anti-Child Marriage Fund. Next slide. Now let me share with you, as part of the monitoring, what has actually been in place. The model law has already been adopted. The Forum is embarking on its monitoring through a new organ of the Forum called the Regional Parliamentary Model Laws Oversight Committee. It is a high-level committee which consists of chairpersons of all the regional standing committees of the Forum. The Oversight Committee will consider issues related to domestication of the model law and will consider country reports on the extent of domestication in each member state. So far, we have received at least 10 reports on this monitoring, and we're expecting the Regional Model Law Oversight Committee to meet sometime in January. Next slide, please. The development of the model law is not an end in itself, but a beginning for national parliaments. They now have a benchmark that they can refer to in view of facilitating their legislative research and drafting process. The guide on the interpretation of the model law significantly facilitates its understanding, and both documents are thus complementary. Would like to appreciate Ms. Maya from UNFPA, who will present immediately after me on this guide. Thank you.
Thank you, Boema, for taking us through what is in the model law and particularly the background of development of the law and giving us insights into its content. I'd now like to introduce Ms. Maya Hansen, who is the Regional Program Specialist in charge of adolescent and youth programs in UNFPA Eastern Southern Africa region. Maya will take us through the Southern Africa Development SADC Model Law guide, as well as its background, and give us a bit of information on its content. Maya, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Yvette, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody out there. For UNFPA, and of course with Girls Not Brides and the SADC Parliamentary Forum, we are extremely proud to sort of like present to you this next chapter of the story of promoting the SADC Model Law on eradicating child marriage and protecting children already in marriage for parliamentarians, civil society organizations, and youth advocates. It really builds on the SADC Model Law in the sense that it's sort of like it unpacks the model law and then it provides actionable steps that can be used by the different stakeholders to take to implement the guide or the model law in countries. Next slide, please. So the guide was really created to promote an understanding of the content and the value of the model law, recognizing that the model law itself is a fairly legal and a little bit of a heavy document, and it may not always be readable or fully understandable by everybody who wishes to use it. So it tries to make the content more accessible to non-legal experts by providing a summary of its key provisions, as they were just presented by Ms. Sigoma just now. And then it provides practical actor-specific guidance and tools on how to use the SADC model law in advocacy efforts in countries. And finally, it seeks to promote cohesion amongst actors working to end child marriage in the SADC region by ensuring that nobody works in silos, but works together towards the advancement of our efforts to prevent and to address the issue of child marriage. Next slide, please. So the guide was developed as a joint initiative of the SADC Parliamentary Forum, Girls Not Brides, and the UNFPA East and Southern Africa Regional Office. It was developed through a participatory process which involved legal experts, parliamentarians, civil society organizations, national and regional youth advocates, and others who were consulted through the formation of an advisory group, individual expert interviews, and strategic meeting or even meetings, some of which were online and some of which were face-to-face meetings. Next slide, please. So this is really just to quickly outline the process of the development of the guide since the adoption of the model law itself in 2016. After the adoption, Girls Not Brides, UNFPA, SADC PF, the AU Goodwill Ambassador, and others sat down and say, so what is next? How do we really make sure that this document is kept alive and not just something that will collect shelf on collect dust on a shelf somewhere? So that really led to the conceptualization of this guide, and further to the selection of consultants, the formation of an advisory group, and finally the before mentioned expert interviews, which guided sort of like the overall outline and also some of the content of the guide. Then there was a number of consensus building meetings to agree on the content, to ensure feedback from the advisory group, which was a mix of national and regional experts. And finally, the strategic meeting, which did not only focus on the content of the guide itself, but also the next steps, once again, on how we could make sure that it was made accessible both to right holders and duty bearers in countries. We then incorporated the feedback, and then we finalized the design and launched it with a soft launch in Malaysia during the Girls Not Brides meeting in June, and finally with the official launch, as mentioned by Yvette, in November during the second Africa Girls Summit in Ghana. Next slide, please. So the content of the guides includes 5 different sections plus some annexes which are equally important. First of all, in section 1, it provides an overview of child marriage in the SADC region. What is child marriage and why it is harmful, and then the prevalence also of child marriage in the SADC region. And of course, noting that this is a living document, and this particular chapter will be updated on a regular basis as we receive new data and new evidence to guide the overview for the region. Next slide, please. Section 2 unpacks what the SADC model law on child marriage is all about, First of all, what is a model law? What can it do and what can it not do? And here I think it's important to really understand that the model law or any model law isn't a binding document, but rather a guiding document that can serve as a yardstick for advocacy and policy and legal reform in countries. It then goes on to talk about why and how the SADC model law on child marriage was developed and its objectives. And then finally, the key features of the SADC model law on child marriage with a brief overview of what it looks like. Next slide, please. Section 3 refers back to the longer presentation that Mr. Goma just presented, which provides a summary of the model law. Once again, it reaffirms basic rights and principles as they pertain not only to the legal age of marriage, but also other human rights, such as the right to health, right to education, right to social protection, and others. It provides provision for the prohibition of child marriage, measures for the prevention of child marriage, guidance for the mitigation of the impact of child marriage, and support for monitoring and awareness raising, and finally, measures for enforcement and compliance. Section 4 and Section 5 are really the most innovative and new parts of the model law in terms of its usability in countries. So Section 4 includes practical guidance for parliamentarians, and it provides a number of different action points with different sub-action points. But broadly, it encourages parliamentarians, first of all, to start out with a comprehensive situation analysis that compares the current legal and policy framework in countries with the provisions of the model law. And this may have to cut across several different laws and policies, as the model law, again, is a multi-sectoral law that does not necessarily only relate to one particular legal framework or policy framework. The second action point is for parliamentarians to advocate in Parliament for national laws and policies to be adopted, to be reviewed and or strengthened, and finally to be implemented in line with the model law. It also encourages parliamentarians to disseminate the model law amongst peers, to build alliances with other parliamentarians. So these could, for example, be the caucuses within parliaments that work on women's and children's rights, vis-a-vis those that works on health issues or education concerns. Fourthly, it talks about promoting accountability to commitments adopted in regional and global fora. So again, the model law is not necessarily to be seen as a standalone one, but it links to a number of legal and policy, global and regional commitments, for example, in relation to CEDAW, in terms of the SADC gender protocol, some of the AU continental frameworks and others. So it enforces what has already been ratified by countries, and it seeks to promote accountability for those commitments. Then it suggests that parliamentarians should ensure adequate budget allocations across different ministries for the prevention of child marriage and to support married girls. But it also goes beyond that. It's not just about budget, but it's really also about spending and implementation capacity to really ensure that what's being budgeted for is also spent. And then finally, to be a champion and opinion leader nationally and within the constituencies to which the parliamentarians belong. Next slide, please. Section 6, which is really the most relevant one to this webinar, is practical guidance for CSOs and young advocates. So again, it includes a number of action points or suggested action points together with specific actions. The first one being direct advocacy with policy and decision makers, building on what parliamentarians may or may not already have done, but really to focus on studying and disseminating the model law, identifying gaps in existing legal and policy frameworks, gather data and evidence to inform legal and policy change, engage in parliamentary dialogues, mobilize support and build capacity of champions for including amongst CSOs and girls themselves. Secondly, it promotes efforts to hold governments accountable to their commitments on ending child marriage, including the status of implementation, reporting, and creation of an enabling environment for CSOs to support implementation and funding budget and tracking. And as we have seen in some countries, it's not always easy for CSOs to engage in advocacy or implementation of existing legal and policy framework or to access funding. So this is an extremely important action point. The third action point is about mobilizing public opinion and raise public awareness. And this goes both for youth, for traditional and religious leaders, and media, with materials and through channels that are adapted and appropriate to the local context and level of literacy, both again for duty bearers and right holders. And then finally, implementation or training of others on the programmatic revisions or provisions of the model law, including in the education sector, in the health sector, amongst police, and for example amongst social protection officers, both to support awareness, but also to support and strengthen implementation of existing legal and policy frameworks. Next slide, please. As I already mentioned, the annexes that are in the guide are not just any annexes. These are really annexes that matters. It provides examples of ways that countries have started using the SADC model law, using the examples of Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Tanzania. And we hope that we will be able to continue updating these as we generate more feedback and evidence from countries. Then it has a section that goes beyond the content of the model law, that looks at issues that require more critical reflection and discussion, and that may be context specific, and for which it was not possible to reach consensus across the countries in the SADC region at the time that we developed the model law. And these relate to the issue of criminalization, of funding of the model law and its implementation, and on monitoring and evaluation, both internally within countries, and again in establishing and linking the M&E of the model law to other existing frameworks and commitments that require accountability from countries. As mentioned by Mr. Goma, the model law also proposes the creation of an anti-child marriage fund, but it doesn't actually provide the details of what this should look like, and the different suggestions are somehow scattered over the model law. So this annex really tries to compile all of the different suggestions into one coherent overview. And then finally, again, the roles and responsibilities for government actors as identified in the model law. These are also scattered throughout the model law for it to be truly multi-sectoral. And therefore, it can be difficult sometimes to go through the model law and fully understand the comprehensive list of roles and responsibilities for an individual government actor. So this annex really tried to synthesize that and provide an overview of what the model law covers and suggests. So next slide, please. In terms of the dissemination, as I started out by saying, this is really just a second step on a journey to ensure full implementation of the model law. And in disseminating both the guide itself and ensuring that it is translated into formats that are useful for the local context in which each one of you operates, we all have a role to play. So the guide itself, as I said, is a remaining document or a living document, and it needs to be updated on a regular basis as we receive more data, more evidence, and more examples of what works in countries. We need to continue building on the model law and the guide to really strengthen the regional movement and the national movements so that everybody feels an ownership of these two documents and are able to take them forward in countries. It is also important that we as actors in the SADC region are an inspiration for other regions. And we already received quite a number of indications or expressions of interest from the Horn of Africa, from Western Central Africa, as well as from Latin America, that are interested in developing something similar to the SADC model law. And we are in close contact with them to really make sure that we share as much as we can from our experience of developing, adopting, and supporting the implementation of the model law in countries. Next slide, please. And finally, of course, and most importantly, the model law exists in few printed versions, but first and foremost, it is an online document, and it can be downloaded both from the UNFPA website using the link that is listed here, as well as from the Girls Not Brides website. And for those of you that are interested in also reading the SADC model law itself in its full length, the guide to the use of the model law includes several hyperlinks to the model law, where it is located on the SADC Parliamentary Forum website, so that you are able to access it from there as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Maya, and thank you, Ms. Boimo, for your presentations. We started by hearing about what is in the model law, the background, the process in developing, and the content, and Ms. Maya has backed that up with what is in the guide, particularly as it very cleverly summarizes what is in the model law, but additionally gives us a view of how, as different stakeholders who are interested in seeing this model law come to light in our own national laws, how that can be profiled either through parliamentarians, through youth advocates, and through civil society alike. We had asked if you could requested if you could send in your questions through the chat box, which is available if you click the orange button, which has an arrow. It will present on the right-hand side, it will present you with a chat box where you can send in some questions. I'll begin by addressing two that have already come in. One was particularly around membership of Girls Not Brides, if individual members can join Girls Not Brides. We accept membership from organizations, and through our website, you'll be able to see what that entails. It takes you through the process of what becoming a member would entail. So we'd like to invite you to go through that and see how best you can join us as a member. That question came in from Sunusi Mohammed. The second question was about French. One of the things that we seek to do in the next year is translating or interpretation of the model law guide into French and Portuguese. So after this is done, we will schedule a webinar that can be conducted to disseminate the information, particularly as Maya said, there's interest to have similar legislation in West and Central Africa. All right, I wanted to address two things, even as we wait for the question. One is that the context in terms of Southern Africa for developing the guide. We know in at least 5 countries, almost 40% of children are married before they're 18 years of age. This is in Mozambique, Malawi, Madagascar, DRC, and others. And we had wanted to have a speaker. We had actually planned to have a speaker from Malawi, but unfortunately, her internet is not very strong, so she cannot join us today, and she has sent in her apologies. So we apologize for that. We will not be able to have shared experiences from Malawi, but as Maya has said, there is in the annex some experiences from Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Tanzania, particularly on what has been done so far in those contexts that are related to implementation of the model law. Another question that has just come in is, what successes could we attribute to the SADC model law so far? And I'd like to invite either Maya or Ms. Boimo to address that question. What successes of the SADC model law have we seen so far?
Thank you very much, Yvette. What successes we have seen in the use of the SADC model law thus far? I would refer again to the 3 sort of like best practices that we see in the guide itself. How the model law was used to inform the amendment of the Constitution and several laws and policies in Malawi. It was also used to guide local public hearings in Zimbabwe when they were in the process of amending also their constitution and relevant laws and policies. In Zambia, it has been used to inform the development of the the strategy and the costed national action plans. And most recently, what we have heard is that in Mozambique, they are looking at adopting the model law in its full length into a national bill on child marriage. So as I said, when we introduced the guide and the model law itself, it is a yardstick, and it is something that can either be used in its full length, or it can be used to inform specific laws and policies, either as advocacy, to stimulate new processes, or to inform and feed into existing processes when the opportunities arises. Maybe Boemo would like to add something.
Well, basically, broadly, that's what's happening. Countries are looking at various legislations that influence actually making sure that the best interest of the child is upheld. Some of them are looking at, registration of children. Some of them are reviewing acts. So it comes across through various acts and bills in Parliament. You will not find that the model law has been wholesale transplanted into a country legislation. So there are all these progress that are going on. And once we are done with our survey, we will make it available probably on one of the websites for people to see what is happening, because it happens across various ministries. The budgetary component also is something that we're seeing progress in terms of improving on those areas. You'll find a huge link on some of the SRHR related initiatives, like for sanitary pads, where countries are trying to remove tax from sanitary pads because they realize that they need to have as much safety nets or social protection initiatives for young girls, among others. So there's a lot going on in terms of what countries are getting inspiration on the model law to basically do. And I think of most important for us is the fact that member parliaments are really using it as a reference document to hold the executive to account, to ask questions, and when bills come before them, to ask for more information and identify the missing gaps. So I guess that's precisely the action that we sought, and that is what we would have loved to see, because the idea is in the adoption process, as the members using the principles that are embodied in the model law to inform provisions in their countries. And I think this is what we are seeing it happening. And is it really serving as a yardstick? Is there commonality, review of policies? Is there harmonization process going on? And we see that this is really going on. And I think that's what underlines the efforts of why we thought it was worthwhile for Southern Africa to look at the model law. And there's a huge, when you look at, we monitor debates in parliaments through the Hansard. We actually look at the frequency, the quality. We look at gender in terms of who's raising these issues, whether they've been exposed, whether they're referring to the model law. And we find that it is a stimulus for debate and advocacy in most of our parliaments. So even if it doesn't lead to any legislative reform, it does indeed inform and does make sure that the aims of developing the model law are actually taken care of. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boema, for that. I think also at a sub-regional level, the model law has presented an opportunity for SADC to come together and form the Regional Parliamentary Model Laws Oversight Committee, which, as you've rightfully said, has already received 10 reports and are scheduled to meet in January. So this informs another way within which, at the sub-regional level, we are seeing governments really commit to ending child marriage and putting this into practice through oversight committees and accountability mechanisms that can guide that action, from rhetoric to action. Another question that has come in from Mohamed Kella in Liberia is how can grassroots organizations use this guide? And I will address that to Maya.
Thank you very much. So again, with the risk of repeating myself, there are different ways in which the guide and the model law itself can be used. And the first one is sort of like in its full length. You can take it like in Mozambique, look at it and fully domesticate it or its content into one or several national laws or policies. You can also, I mean, like in Mozambique, you can create a new comprehensive national model law on child marriage. And though it was not done in all countries, it can certainly be done. Then it may also inform the review of existing legal framework and draw from the different parts of the model law to amend specific existing laws. So again, this is sort of like, and some grassroots organizations or CSOs like Plan International has tried to develop almost like a checklist based on the provisions in the model law that you can use when you're using when you're doing the review of existing laws and policies. And then it can serve as a reference for policymakers to initiate or influence policy reform processes, or it can be used to develop and implement and monitor national strategies and action plans. But all of this is really very much sort of like a process where civil society or grassroots organizations are holding parliamentarians accountable, or those that are able to influence decision-making processes. I think amongst grassroots organizations themselves, the guide and the model law also has the opportunity to actually inform programmatic work that is being done. So not only does it provide a framework for policy or legal revisions, but also a framework for programmatic responses. So if you are trying to put together as a grassroots organization in Liberia or anywhere else, your program, a comprehensive program or a fairly simple program that seeks to address one or more issues in relation to child marriage, then this is an area that can help you defining what you would like to do and also how you wish to operate with others to really ensure that you are able to reach out and create sort of like more of a multi-sectoral model that allow you to leverage on the technical expertise and resources that other peer grassroots organizations have.
Thank you, Maya. Another question comes in from our colleague Eugenia from Latin America, and I would address this to Ms. Boemo. Do we have any concrete budgetary goals for the model law, like a set of indicators or amounts of money that should be allocated per country?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Allow me, if you can, to just go back to the one on grassroots before I respond to this one. Just to indicate that depending on what grassroots is, we are looking at any citizen, any human being who's concerned about this issue, who needs to mitigate child marriage, and there are systems in each parliament. The model law is developed at the regional level, but is devolved to national parliaments to work with them. And any citizen in any constituency should work through their constituency offices where they exist, to make sure that they can communicate with their representatives on what is it that they wish to see change in related to this child marriage. And there are systems in parliament. We are avoiding a situation where we're always picketing, always protesting, or things spiral out of control before issues are addressed through the existing frameworks or systems in parliament. And would encourage organizations to actually push for translation of some of these. That has been a huge criticism, that some of these provisions should be translated, that we should go out and educate, not to leave it among the elite groups or groups that already know what they're talking about. Now, related to the issue of budgets, I think We cannot, because of sovereignty of countries, we cannot dictate to countries how they should budget for these provisions in the model law. And the ministers of finance, we've had other protocols, other commitments where we say 15% to health and this and that, and this has been hugely criticized in terms of allocating a percentage, such a huge development issue. But what you find happening in most countries is that where they feel there's need to ensure that children go to school, you find that there is an increase in a certain budgetary allocation for that. Where they want to look at social protection, they do that. And we don't want a situation where we are curbing countries to say 10% or 15%, but we will recognize programs and activities through oversight of Parliament where there's been recognition or there's been an impact on how some of the debates or input into the budget have led to a certain increase. But we didn't put in any indicators to say so much percentage, which has been a trend in how we budget for some of these commitments or instruments. Thanks.
Could either of you tell us more about the anti-child marriage fund that has been proposed in both the SADC Model Law and in the guide?
Just to indicate that there's no quantum to the fund. Each country, depending on the prevalence and the issues they're dealing with, they can decide to scale up and deal with the issue in a manner that will be impactful. And really, that will depend. There are countries who don't feel like Mauritius, Seychelles, who don't believe that they need to really be putting efforts there, but they may be putting efforts in other systems and how to deal with this particular fund. And we've left the logistics because during the development, there was a lot of input in terms of let's not dictate, other countries can do better, and others have done better than others in this area. And we've left it open so that countries can be motivated based on the country context. Thank you.
Maya, do you have anything to add on the anti-child marriage fund?
No, I think as Buemo is saying, it's a recommendations for countries to do that, but it's not necessarily, it's not prescriptive as to what it should look like and what the funding sources should be. But just, I think it's a means to try to ensure that the work that is being done under the model law or national related laws and policies is fully funded. And it goes very much back to the ongoing discussion that we already see with regards to costed national action plans and strategies in many countries, where we do see that though they are costed, there's still insufficient allocation of resources to ensure the implementation or tracking of expenditures. So the anti-child marriage fund would be a means whereby the different stakeholders, the different sectors that are involved in this at all different levels would be able to create this one pool of funding that can ensure that the commitments that are made by decision makers are actually implemented.
And you find, sorry, allow me.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
You find that certain actions you cannot really quantify. For instance, if you look at what they're doing to make pronouncements and have bylaws on some of these issues, I think in the long run, when we look at enforcement, we may be able to quantify and say this has been the act of this area to that area. And when you look at advocacy that is also integrated in other similar related initiatives. So we need to really look at, and countries that have budget offices like in Parliament, it will be easy for us to isolate some of these things because when activities are conducted, it is very easy to know what was before a committee and what ended up happening in that regard. And then we can move to the ministerial level where we actually look at what was the deliberate allocation, what activities were done, and streamline to such efforts. So this will require much more effort and a lot of analysis that will really give us more appropriate or maybe more scientific results on some of these areas.
Okay, we have 5 minutes to the conclusion of our webinar, but before we do that, I'd like to invite each of you to give in your last parting shot for those of our audience and those who will be listening in to the recording. You can start with Wema and then have Maya give your last word of parting shot on the SADC Model Law and Guide respectively.
Well, just to indicate that the model law is a great document that should continue to be shared all over the world. We are happy that the African Union has actually embraced the model law, and we feel that it will go beyond just the SADC region. We also believe that we should continue to sensitize policymakers, drafters, staff of parliament, and institutionalize such documents so that they can be used and not collect dust. And also to say that civil society organizations should really take this as a tool to hold parliaments accountable at every given opportunity and to assist us in educating the citizens of their countries on the value of this model law and how it can really improve people's lives and change the situation on child marriages. The guide was such a great post-adoption strategy document, and I believe that it will go a long way with assisting and helping most of our stakeholders. Another plea is that it would be important to translate the model law even beyond French and Portuguese. We've gotten a huge several requests on KISS. We've got some countries requesting that we should translate it in all the languages of the African Union because it will go a long way. And this has become a right issue in terms of access to information. So I hope that countries or listeners out there who find this useful could engage us and we could allow them to translate the model law and the guide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Wema. Maya?
Yeah, so from my side, I think I would echo what Boemo is saying, but really also go back to the comment from Liberia and help us also, or help guiding us, and not just from Liberia, of course, but also from grassroots and CSOs within the region, for us to continuously update and continuously translate the guide into something that is even more digestible, so that the guide and the model law itself becomes known by everybody within the region and beyond, and becomes that useful tool that can help advancing advocacy, policy, and programmatic efforts within your respective countries. It's really, I mean, a model law in itself is nothing unless it is taken forward by the very users of the model law and those that have an interest in child marriage, and more broadly on adolescent girls' welfare. So therefore, that feedback to really ensure that that we translate it into products such as radio programs, school-based programs, for information that is useful for health service providers, for police, and anyone else, is fed back to us, so that we as United Nations Population Fund, the SADC PF, and Girls Not Rights can help you developing such products.
Thank you, Maya. I want to begin with what you've just concluded on in terms of the formats of dissemination of the guide and the model law in itself, in stating that in as much as we have the guide divided into different sections for parliamentarians and for the youth and civil society advocates alike, it also honors up to us to see which format would be best or most appropriate to also disseminate this guide to these stakeholders. So recognizing that, the partners mentioned, that's SADC PF, Girls Not Brides, and UNFPA, will seek to disseminate this to youth using adequate platforms such as Facebook chats and other social media platforms and channels available to us to see how best we can get youth advocates involved in reading of the model law, understanding the guide to the model law, and how best they can use this in their own internal advocacy arrangements to their national parliaments and to their governments. Secondly, we also hope to host a second webinar with parliamentarians across Southern Africa region and perhaps abroad as well, beyond Africa, to be able to get some enlightenment on what would be the key things to take forward, particularly as has been mentioned by Boemo, that the exciting prospects of having an oversight committee and the outcome of that meeting in January would be good to be shared with other parliamentarian networks like the International Parliamentarian Union and others who are working across Africa and beyond, including those in the Organization of American States who have really put out their interest in seeing how they can develop a similar model law in their region. We also seek to have a two-pager for parliamentarians that will guide that interaction, highlighting the usefulness of the guide, which they can then contextualize according to their different settings and contexts. We hope to have this Facebook chat for the youth and webinar in January, if possible, to sustain the momentum we have generated from the launch of the guide that took place end of last month and the webinar we are having today, to see how we can pick up on this momentum to ensure that those who are interested in developing the guide in their regions, as has been mentioned, Horn of Africa, West and Central Africa, and in Latin America, can use some of the lessons learned, the challenges and opportunities to pick up on these conversations in their own contexts. We also hope to have conversations around key challenges that had been mentioned by Maya, including criminalization and others that were not privy to the conversations that were taking place in the development of this guide. And this can be done through social media channels as well. But particularly in the next steps that had been included in the presentations was development of a community of practice that would then be having these conversations at a regular interval, ensuring that there's a group of strategic advisors and thinkers who are working on the issue, either from the legal perspective as parliamentarians or from the advocacy perspective as youth and civil society, to be able to pick up these conversations and hold governments accountable in partnership, as has been highlighted previously. That said, I would like to thank all the participants who are able to join us and who will be listening into this webinar. Special thanks goes to both my speakers, Ms. Boemo Segoma of the SADC Parliamentary Forum and Ms. Maya Hansen of UNFPA. Special thanks also goes to the team facilitating in London. As we said, this is a first of a series of webinars, and we hope you'll be able to join us in others, as well as identify your interest in joining the community of practice. Thank you very much from my end. It's goodbye.